Hey people, Trish Wood here. As you know, I don't normally reach out to you guys midweek or on video either, so this is two new things. But I wanted to post this for you to clarify once and for all an update I have on Dr. Tony Fauci and how we might want to be viewing him these days, especially given there's a new documentary coming out produced by Nat Geo and I think funded by Disney that looks like what we call in the business a hagiography, meaning a Valentine card. And also because the evidence that the virus came from a Wuhan lab leak, either by design or by accident, it's a near certainty now. Only a fool is disputing this. And that suggests, obviously, that Tony Fauci's comments about it under oath were likely untrue. And that is not a small thing from the man who is running the COVID response virtually for the entire world. So I want to clarify a couple of things. The main thing for me as a journalist who has been in the business forever, longer than I care to say, is that, I covered Tony Fauci back in the day during AIDS and HIV. And he was not worshipped. His approach was not well liked. In fact, people with AIDS, ACT UP was the organization, gay young men, smart, most of them pretty well off too, which helped obviously, were chaining themselves to the chain link fence at the NIH protesting Dr. Fauci. They were dropping like flies, those guys. When AIDS first happened, if you got it, it was a death sentence. There was no way out. There was no therapies at all. There was no hope of a vaccine, even though they announced there was going to be a vaccine every year at the AIDS conferences. I was there. I heard them do it. And the media would dutifully report vaccine in a year. And then there would be there still isn't a vaccine, right? But they were in love with the idea of there being a vaccine. So it sound familiar? And it also took a long time for therapeutics, but the therapeutics that saved lives at the beginning, those drugs came from the frontline clinicians who were treating these guys. And they had to take some risks because the prognosis for people with AIDS was just awful. And they were young men, the doctors were trying desperately to save them. And as a result of that dynamic, they discovered some pharmaceutical products off-label, already in existence, nobody was going to get rich from them, that had a big impact. One of them was Bactrim. Bactrim used against pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, which was the big AIDS pneumonia that, if you got it, it was a death sentence, no question about it. So everybody was desperate for something to use against PCP pneumonia. Here's what happened, and here's how I know it's true. I was part of this story. Michael Callen, who was a person with AIDS, one of the longest living people with AIDS at that time, I think 11 years or something like that, remarkable guy. He and I became friends from my being involved in covering AIDS, especially on the American scene. And he was desperate to get the idea that Bactrim worked against PCP as they'd seen in trials in various doctors' offices, and there were lots of doctors pushing this forward. He was desperate for Tony Fauci at the same place he is now to put out a bulletin to inform clinicians that yes, this can have a good impact. The downside of it was very small. It's Bactrim, it's a sulfa drug. Some people are allergic. You could test for it first, but it's similar to an antibiotic, and it was having really good results. So Michael went with some other people, maybe Joe Sonnabend, not sure about that, and they went to see Tony, and they begged him to put out some kind of an advisory to treating clinicians so that they would at least have something in their arsenal against PCP. Tony wouldn't do it, would not do it, refused to do it. He has now kind of whitewashed that story. He says for a different reason he didn't feel he had the authority to do that or whatever. And understand too that there was no internet really in those days, so he would have had to do it through his information system that was spreading out from NIH. He was in a perfect opportunity to spread that information, but he chose not to. He refused to. Later, when Michael was dying of AIDS finally, in the early 90s, I interviewed Michael and about his life and death, and he said that his biggest regret in all of the things in his life was that he was not able to convince Tony Fauci to send that bulletin out. He never got over it. He was tormented by it. He didn't understand it. He didn't want to think Tony Fauci was a bad person. He couldn't understand why he wouldn't want to do this thing to save lives. And he died shortly after that. It was a very moving interview. I then did an interview with Tony Fauci at NIH in his office there and asked him the same questions. And he gave me answers that are not squaring with what he now says happened. What he said to me then was that he wanted more studies, bigger studies, placebo-controlled double-blind studies. That's the gold standard. Yeah, that is. But when guys are dying and they're willing to take a chance because they're going to die anyway and there's good results, why wouldn't you let the doctor and the patient make this decision? It's kind of the same as ivermectin, kind of the same as hydroxychloroquine, waiting for vaccines, pushing down cheap therapies, and in the meantime, people were dying at a much bigger rate. I mean, in the early days of AIDS, it was like almost 100% you died. It was terrible. But he wouldn't do it. And my understanding of the numbers of people who would have benefited from Bactrim and who died between that time and when it was finally approved, about a year and a bit later, was between 17,000 and 30,000 people. That's what happened there. So there are days that I wonder why ACT UP, which is still in existence, isn't taking a different side in this, but they seem to be supporting Tony Fauci. I know there was a rapprochement of some kind, and I think it might be politics. You know, Tony Fauci didn't like Trump. People on the left don't like Trump. Maybe it was a strange bedfellow situation. I don't know. But you'd think that they would be the first ones out there saying, why aren't you listening to clinicians? You know, it worked for us if you know, very, very frustrating for me. Anyway, I witnessed those things. I saw them. And when COVID first broke, I wrote a letter to some journalists telling this story and asking them to be extra special careful of Tony Fauci and to hold him accountable. You know, it's tempting in the middle of a crisis to not hold people accountable. We're all in it together. That's exactly when you should hold people accountable, in the run-up to a war, during a pandemic when bureaucrats have ultimate power. That's when you're supposed to ask hard questions. That's not patriotic. That's not caring about your neighbor. Exactly the opposite. But that's not happening here. I sent that letter out in March of 2020, that long ago, telling those very stories, and I heard nothing back. Now, I'm just a girl with a podcast from Canada. American journalists tend to look down their noses a bit at us. They shouldn't, but they do. And I heard nothing back. The other thing I just wanted to end on was that at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this terrible, terrible study which suggested that even children were going to get AIDS through casual contact in a household where somebody was infected. Absolute, total garbage. Couldn't happen, wouldn't happen, didn't happen. And yet, Dr. Fauci pushed the study to the media. He gave it credibility. And you know what happened? That is what started the whole hysteria against people with AIDS. I remember that cameramen, as they were called then, some didn't even want to put a microphone on a person with AIDS. They were so afraid of contracting it. That is a direct result of the hysteria started by that study. It frightened everybody, and it was given oxygen by Tony Fauci. So the fear campaign, right? So with the documentary coming out, with the book by Sherry Markson that I had on the program last week, which makes the Wuhan lab leak funded by Tony Fauci and Francis Collins a near certainty, I am gobsmacked that the legacy media in America and other countries too are giving Tony Fauci a pass. I bear this guy no malice. I think he has a hard job. I'm sure he is broken over the stress that he's been under chasing these two viruses in his lifetime. But you know what? He probably shouldn't be doing it. If he's actually got post-traumatic stress disorder from the handling of HIV and AIDS, maybe he shouldn't be handling this. He's maybe got too much baggage. We need clear-headedness. We don't need fear. We don't need tears. And I'm just going to say something maybe not very, very nice, but I have not seen any tears for the people who have been desperately harmed by the collateral damage caused by some of these policies coming out of Washington. So yes, I have sympathy for Tony Fauci, but maybe I'm a hard ass. I have a lot of sympathy for people whose children have committed suicide, who can't get their cancer treatments, whose loved one has died of a drug overdose, or even the people more generally who have been driven psychotically mad by the propaganda and fear campaign from the nudge units in various countries that feel that the only way to get compliance is to scare people. You can't unring this bell. And so, yeah, I didn't like seeing Tony Fauci crying in that little clip in the trailer, but I've seen more tears, bigger tears over much sadder situations than he finds himself in. I'm sorry. So I just wanted to document this for you. You're going to see more discussions of these things over the next few weeks. And I just wanted you to know the truth as I saw it, and I loved it. Okay, see ya.